Kenji Tanaka lived inside a fortress of his own making, a sprawling estate in the quiet green hills of the United States. He was a Japanese billionaire, and his wealth was as vast and silent as the mansion he inhabited. People knew his name, of course, especially in business circles. They knew he was sharp, ruthless, and unbelievably successful. But no one actually knew Kenji Tanaka. He was a ghost in his own opulent life, a shadow moving through polished halls, leaving behind only the echoes of his footsteps. His reputation was clear, unapproachable. His eyes, they said, held no warmth. His words were few, always to the point, and never wasted on pleasantries. He had built an empire from nothing, a feat that commanded respect, but also a distance that few dared to cross. He was a man of immense power, yet utterly alone. His fortune could buy anything, it seemed, except companionship or a genuine smile. The air around him always felt thin, as if emotion itself struggled to breathe in his presence. Kenji's days were a meticulously crafted routine. He woke at precisely 5 a.m., meditated for an hour, then spent 2 hours in his home office, a fortress within a fortress, where he managed his global ventures. Breakfast was a simple affair, eaten in silence at a long dining table that could seat 20, but always held only one. His meals were prepared by a chef who understood his palate, but never dared to engage him in conversation beyond confirming the menu. After breakfast, more work, then a solitary walk through his perfectly manicured gardens. Always alone, always lost in thought. Lunch, more work, a brief workout in his private gym, then dinner, another silent meal. His evenings were spent reading complex financial reports or classic Japanese literature, never for pleasure, always for knowledge or a deeper understanding of the world he dominated. There were no friends, no family visits, no casual calls. His world was a perfectly ordered machine, and he was its solitary operator. The staff understood his demands. Mr. Tanaka expected perfection, efficiency, and absolute discretion. His household manager, a stern but loyal woman named Mrs. Albright, had been with him for 15 years. She ran the estate like a military operation, ensuring every cushion was fluffed, every surface gleamed, every meal was on time. She respected Kenji, of course. How could she not? He paid well, he was fair, and he never raised his voice. But she also found him baffling. He was like a beautiful, intricate clock that ran perfectly but had no heart. She saw the wealth, the power, the strict schedule, but she never saw the man beneath it all. The other staff felt the same, a mix of awe and a quiet, almost fearful reverence. They cleaned his clothes, cooked his food, maintained his home, but they never touched his inner world. It was an unspoken rule, a barrier as invisible as it was impenetrable. They understood his commands, but they couldn't understand him. Recently, the household had a small hiccup. One of the maids, a young woman who had only been there 6 months, had left suddenly, citing family reasons. Kenji, in his usual detached manner, simply instructed Mrs. Albright to find a replacement. Efficient, quiet, and understands the importance of privacy, he had stated, not even looking up from his tablet. This need for a new maid, seemingly a small detail in the vastness of Kenji's life, would unknowingly set a chain of events in motion, events that would slowly chip away at the walls he had built around himself. Beneath Kenji's perfectly composed exterior, hidden from every prying eye, lay a deep, unresolved pain. It wasn't something he spoke of, or even acknowledged directly to himself. It was a dull ache, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life. It was why he built his fortress, why he kept everyone at arm's length. The opulence, the power, the endless work. They were all distractions, carefully placed bricks in the wall meant to keep the world, and more importantly, his past, out. He carried a burden, heavy and silent, that made him believe he was undeserving of warmth, joy, or connection. The world saw a titan of industry, but beneath the designer suits and the impassive gaze, there was a man haunted by something he couldn't escape, a wound that had never healed, leaving him emotionally detached and profoundly, utterly alone. The search for a new maid brought Maria into Kenji's perfectly ordered world. Maria was a single mother, her soft brown eyes holding a quiet strength, a resilience forged from years of working hard to provide for her daughter, Elena. She wasn't flashy or loud. She was simply earnest and dedicated, her hands calloused from honest labor, her spirit unbroken despite life's many challenges. Her goal was straightforward: find stable employment, earn enough to keep a roof over their heads, and ensure Elena had every opportunity she could possibly give her. The ad for a maid in a private estate, with good pay and benefits, felt like a lifeline. The interview process was, as expected, rigorous. Mrs. Albright, with her sharp eyes and even sharper questions, put Maria through her paces. Every aspect of her past employment was scrutinized. References were checked meticulously, and her cleaning techniques were even observed during a trial shift. Kenji, true to form, made only a brief appearance. He sat in his study, a formidable figure behind a large mahogany desk, his gaze sweeping over Maria for a mere few seconds before he nodded, almost imperceptibly, to Mrs. Albright. That was his approval. Maria, despite the intimidating environment and the silent, powerful man, maintained her composure. Her gentle demeanor, combined with her impeccable work ethic and quiet confidence, somehow managed to pass Kenji's stringent, unspoken criteria. She was hired. Elena, a bright-eyed girl of 7, was an extension of Maria's quiet strength, though with an added layer of innocent curiosity. She accompanied her mother to the estate on Maria's first day, wide-eyed with wonder at the sheer size and grandeur of the mansion. The polished marble floors stretched endlessly, the ceilings soared, and the vast rooms held an almost ethereal silence. To Elena, it wasn't just a house. It was a castle, a place of quiet mystery. She held her mother's hand tightly, her small face alight with a mix of awe and a little apprehension. The house was beautiful, yes, but it felt strangely empty. Despite its opulence, there were no toys scattered on the floor, no cheerful sounds, just the hushed movements of the staff. Initial interactions between Kenji and Maria were, predictably, superficial. Kenji remained an aloof, distant figure, a shadow moving through the grand halls. Maria, for her part, was respectful and efficient, moving through her duties with practiced grace. She cleaned, she organized, she maintained the pristine order of the estate, always aware of Kenji's presence, yet never directly engaging with him beyond a polite, almost imperceptible nod if their paths crossed. She understood her role: to be seen as little as possible, to perform her tasks flawlessly, and to respect the unspoken boundaries of the household. Elena, however, was a child, and boundaries were not something she instinctively understood. Her natural curiosity often led her to wander slightly, her small, quick feet carrying her through the quieter corridors when her mother was busy in another part of the house. These explorations led to fleeting, often unnoticed encounters with Kenji. Once, she saw him in the vast library, a tiny figure dwarfed by towering bookshelves, his back to her as he read, utterly absorbed. Another time, she glimpsed him through a half-open door to the main living room, sitting by a roaring fireplace, staring into the flames, a look of profound contemplation on his face. These moments were brief, Kenji never seeing her, Elena always melting back into the shadows before she could be spotted. They were like two ships passing in the night, each unaware of the other's brief proximity. Maria, dedicated to her new job, worked tirelessly. She knew this was her chance to provide a better life for Elena. She meticulously cleaned, organized, and ensured every detail was perfect, all while balancing her responsibilities as a mother. Elena would often sit quietly in a corner of a room Maria was cleaning, drawing in a small notebook or reading a book, her presence a comforting, soft hum in the otherwise rigid quietness of the mansion. Maria made sure Elena was never in the way, always respectful of the strict rules of the house. She taught Elena to be polite, to keep her voice low, and to respect Mr. Tanaka's privacy. But even with these rules, Elena's innocent presence was a subtle, almost imperceptible disruption to the mansion's sterile calm. Maria often wondered what Kenji thought of having a child in his home. But he never said anything, never reacted. He was a man of silence, and Maria accepted that. She just hoped their presence wasn't an inconvenience, that their quiet lives wouldn't disturb his. Every evening, after her shift, Maria would take Elena home to their small apartment, tired but content. The estate was a world away from their humble dwelling, a place of immense wealth and profound solitude. Maria often thought about Kenji, this powerful, enigmatic man who owned so much, yet seemed to possess so little joy. She saw the precision in his life, the cold efficiency, but she also sensed a deep emptiness, a void that all his wealth couldn't fill. She didn't understand him. Not really. But she felt a quiet pity for the man who lived in such a grand, yet utterly lonely world. She just focused on her work, on doing her best, and on raising Elena. The mansion was a place of work, Kenji a distant employer, and their lives were separate. Or so she thought. Elena's fascination with Kenji grew day by day. She watched him from a distance, like a small, curious bird observing a majestic, yet motionless statue. She noticed how he always wore the same kind of dark suit, how his steps made hardly any sound on the polished floors, and how he always sat in the same armchair in the library, looking out the large window. Others might have just seen a rich man, but Elena saw the small details. The way his fingers tapped softly on the armrest when he was deep in thought, the slight tilt of his head when he focused on a book, the almost imperceptible sigh he sometimes let out when he thought no one was listening. These were tiny things, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Elena, they were clues to a puzzle, glimpses into the quiet world of Mr. Tanaka. There were small, almost accidental moments where Elena's presence, or even just her sound, seemed to brush against Kenji's carefully constructed routine. Once, she was playing quietly with a small toy car in the hallway, letting out a soft vroom sound as it rolled. The sound, light as it was, carried through the silent house. Kenji, who was walking down the grand staircase, paused for a fraction of a second. His head didn't turn, his pace didn't change, but Maria, who was polishing a nearby table, saw his shoulders tighten, just a little. It was a fleeting moment, gone before anyone could truly register it. But it happened. Another time, Elena, while helping her mother dust a sunlit room, giggled at a funny shape she saw in a cloud outside the window. Her laughter was clear and innocent, a sound rarely heard in the mansion. Kenji, in his study at the end of the hall, paused his hand midair as he reached for a document. He didn't look up, but his movement stopped. And then, after a brief, almost imperceptible delay, he continued. It was as if the sound had caused a tiny ripple in his otherwise perfectly still pond. Sometimes, Elena would leave a small drawing on a table, a simple stick figure, or a flower, and forget it there. One morning, Kenji was walking through the living room, heading towards the dining area for his breakfast. His eyes, usually fixed straight ahead, glanced down. There, on a side table, was one of Elena's drawings, a bright red flower with a wobbly green stem. He didn't pick it up, didn't even slow down, but for a split second his gaze lingered. Maria, wiping down the breakfast bar, saw it. It wasn't a reaction, not really, but it was a pause. A moment where the outside world, in the form of a child's drawing, seemed to briefly break through his usual focus. Maria started to notice these things too. She saw the way Kenji would sometimes, just sometimes, seem to listen more intently when Elena was nearby, even if he pretended not to. She saw the tiny hesitations, the almost imperceptible changes in his posture. It was like watching a very still lake suddenly show a tiny tremor on its surface. These weren't big changes, not yet, but they were there. They made Maria wonder about the man behind the stiff suits and the silent demeanor. What was he like underneath all that quiet? What did he think about? Did he ever smile? She knew it was probably foolish to think about such things, but Elena, with her innocent curiosity, seemed to be chipping away at something in the mansion, something that had been solid and unmoving for a long time. Elena, being a child, was naturally drawn to places that held a sense of mystery. The mansion had many such places. There were doors that were always closed, rooms that were never used, corners that were always shadowed. These were the forbidden areas to Maria, places she taught Elena to avoid. But Elena's imagination was strong. She would often find herself wandering towards these areas, not to go inside, but just to look, to wonder what was behind those heavy carved doors. She imagined ancient secrets, forgotten treasures, or maybe, just maybe, a hidden room where Mr. Tanaka kept all his smiles. These explorations were always innocent, always just on the edge of what was allowed, fueling her growing curiosity about the man who lived in this giant quiet house. One afternoon, Maria was busy cleaning a large ballroom that was rarely used. Elena, who had been reading in a corner, eventually put her book down. She wandered into the adjacent music room, a grand space with a large, dark piano. Unbeknownst to her, Kenji was already there, sitting in a velvet armchair in a shadowy corner, reading a book. He was so still, so quiet, that Elena didn't even notice him at first. She just sat on the floor, leaning against the cold leg of the piano, and started humming a soft tune she had learned in kindergarten. Kenji, from his corner, didn't move a muscle. He didn't look up from his book, but he stopped turning the page. He just sat there, listening to the child's soft, off-key humming. Elena, completely unaware of his presence, continued to hum, lost in her own little world. For a few minutes, the vast, silent music room was filled with the gentle, innocent sound of a child and the quiet, almost invisible presence of a man. It was a shared moment, completely unacknowledged by either of them, but a subtle connection was forming in the silence, a fragile thread woven between the child's innocence and the billionaire's solitude. Kenji eventually turned a page, a soft rustle of paper breaking the spell, and Elena, sensing her mother might be looking for her, quietly slipped out of the room. Neither of them knew how significant that small, quiet moment would become. It was just a breath, a hum, a pause, but sometimes That's all it takes for something to begin to change. Elena, with her keen observations and growing fascination, began to channel her perceptions of Kenji and the grand estate into her drawings. She used crayons and thick paper, creating vivid, if childlike, interpretations of the world around her. She drew the tall, silent hedges of the garden, the imposing gates, and sometimes a figure she recognized as Kenji, often depicted as a very tall, somewhat blocky man, usually holding a book or looking out a window. Her drawings weren't detailed or precise, but they held an innocent truth, capturing the essence of what she saw through her young eyes. They were honest, unfiltered expressions of her world. She would draw the big, empty rooms and sometimes put herself in them, a tiny figure with a big smile, or Kenji, a tiny figure with a serious face. These drawings were her way of making sense of the quiet, formal world she now inhabited with her mother. One morning, after breakfast, Elena was drawing at a small table in the kitchen, a place where Maria often allowed her to play while she worked nearby. Kenji, in an unusual turn of events, decided to come into the kitchen for a glass of water himself, a task usually performed by staff. He rarely deviated from his routine, and even more rarely entered the kitchen. As he reached for a glass, a stray piece of paper, colorful and slightly crumpled, caught his eye. It had evidently fallen from Elena's table and slid beneath a counter. Out of pure habit, he bent down to pick it up, intending to discard it. But as his fingers closed around the paper, he saw what it was. One of Elena's drawings. It was a simple picture, a stick figure rendition of the mansion. But in the center, there was a small, almost hidden figure, unmistakably him, holding a tiny, bright red flower. He paused, holding the drawing, his usual rigid posture softening just a fraction. He felt a strange, unfamiliar tug in his chest. It wasn't a grand work of art, but it was his world, seen through the eyes of a child, and somehow it felt more real than any photograph. He carefully folded the small drawing and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, a gesture so subtle that Maria, who was momentarily turned away, didn't even notice. From that day on, Kenji became more consciously aware of Elena's presence. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift, but a gradual awakening. He started noticing the small, almost imperceptible things, the sound of her soft footsteps echoing in the long hallways, the faint scent of her crayons in the study when she'd been playing there earlier, the way she would sometimes hum a little tune while walking past his office door. He noticed how she would occasionally leave a small toy, a plastic animal or a bright block, on a windowsill in the sun, as if offering it warmth. He saw her innocent joy when she discovered a ladybug in the garden, or the focused intensity when she was deeply engrossed in a book. These weren't things he sought out, but once he started noticing them, they were everywhere. It was like a quiet melody had been introduced into the silent symphony of his life, a melody he hadn't realized was missing until he heard it. He still wouldn't acknowledge her directly, but his internal landscape was definitely shifting. Maria, always observant, couldn't help but notice these subtle changes in Kenji. She saw the way his gaze would linger a moment longer on Elena, or how he seemed less startled when Elena's laughter occasionally broke the mansion's quiet. While she still felt a mother's natural protectiveness over Elena, making sure her daughter didn't overstep any boundaries, a new kind of hope began to bloom in her heart. She saw the possibility that Elena's innocent, unburdened presence was beginning to chip away at the formidable wall Kenji had built around himself. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed by Kenji's usual aloofness, but it was there. She wondered if, perhaps, Elena was seeing something in Kenji that no one else had bothered to look for, or perhaps something that Kenji himself had forgotten. Maria watched, cautious but hopeful, as her daughter's pure spirit continued to weave itself into the fabric of the billionaire's isolated life. Kenji's past, a dark, heavy cloak he carried everywhere, began to stir. The quiet moments, the innocent drawings, Elena's soft humming. They were like tiny sparks in a long dormant fire. Memories, once carefully locked away, seemed to nudge at the edges of his consciousness. He would find himself lost in thought, staring out a window, a faint shadow passing over his eyes. He didn't know why these feelings were surfacing now, after so many years, but Elena's presence was undeniably connected to them. It was as if her youth and innocence were inadvertently challenging the decades of carefully constructed emotional barriers he had maintained. He was still Kenji Tanaka, the stoic billionaire, but something inside him was shifting, a silent tremor beneath the surface of his perfectly controlled world. He felt a strange mixture of discomfort and a pull he couldn't quite name. One afternoon, Kenji was walking through the main hall, heading towards his study. Elena was sitting on the floor near a large window, diligently coloring in a book. As he approached, she looked up, her bright eyes meeting his for a fleeting second. For a moment, a fraction of a second, Kenji felt an impulse to stop, to acknowledge her, perhaps even to offer a small, polite nod. The words, "hello," almost formed on his lips. But years of habit, of maintaining distance, of holding his emotions in check, kicked in. His face remained impassive, his stride unbroken. He simply walked past her, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Elena, sensing his unspoken dismissal, lowered her eyes back to her coloring book, a slight slump in her small shoulders. Kenji continued to his study, but once inside, he found himself standing by the window, looking out, his mind replaying that brief, unacknowledged moment. He felt a strange pang, a feeling he couldn't quite identify, but it lingered. A subtle ache that was new and unsettling. The emotional barriers were still strong, too strong to break in a single moment, but the cracks were starting to form. The mansion's quiet routine was suddenly broken by an unexpected turn of events. Elena fell ill. It started subtly, a cough here, a sniffle there, but quickly escalated into a fever that left her weak and listless. Maria, naturally, was beside herself with worry. Every mother's nightmare is seeing their child suffer, and Maria was no exception. She spent every spare moment by Elena's bedside, gently stroking her forehead, trying to coax her to eat, and whispering words of comfort. The doctor's visits became a regular occurrence, and the usually meticulous household tasks took a back seat. As Maria's focus narrowed entirely on her daughter's recovery, she had to take time off work, explaining the situation to the household manager, her voice tight with concern. The manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Davies, understood completely, assuring Maria that Elena's health was the priority. News of Elena's illness eventually reached Kenji. It wasn't direct, of course. He rarely engaged in direct conversation about his staff's personal lives, but he overheard Mrs. Davies discussing Maria's absence and the reason for it. He found himself, much to his own surprise, asking about Elena's well-being. It was a simple, almost gruff question directed at Mrs. Davies during one of their morning briefings, but it was enough to make Mrs. Davies pause, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she quickly composed herself. Kenji repeated the question, perhaps a little more insistently, and Mrs. Davies provided a brief update, mentioning the fever and Maria's tireless care. This unexpected concern from Kenji was baffling to the staff. It was completely out of character for the reclusive billionaire who rarely showed interest in anything beyond his business and his own meticulously ordered world. Maria, when Mrs. Davies relayed Kenji's inquiry, felt a strange mix of gratitude and confusion. She hadn't expected him to even notice her absence, let alone ask about Elena. A few days later, the fever stubbornly persisted, though Elena was slowly starting to show small signs of improvement. Kenji, finding himself unable to concentrate on his work, felt an inexplicable pull towards the part of the mansion where Maria and Elena stayed. He told himself he was merely checking on the household, ensuring everything was running smoothly despite Maria's absence. But his steps led him, almost without conscious direction, to the corridor outside Elena's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear Maria's soft voice inside, comforting Elena. He paused, listening. "Are you thirsty, little one?" Maria asked gently. Elena's voice was weak, but clear enough for Kenji to hear. "No, Mama. Just... I wish I had my bunny, the one from the storybook." Kenji froze. The bunny from the storybook. He remembered Elena's little drawings, some of them featuring a fluffy white bunny with big floppy ears. He had seen the book once, left open on a table in the living room, a children's story about a brave little rabbit. He stood there for a few more moments, the sound of Maria singing a quiet lullaby to her daughter, filling the otherwise silent hallway. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was a mix of sadness for the sick child and a yearning he couldn't quite place. His internal struggle was intense. One part of him, the part that had governed his life for decades, urged him to retreat, to maintain his distance, to not get involved. This was not his concern. He was Kenji Tanaka, a man of business, not a caretaker of children. But another part, a smaller, quieter voice that had begun to stir since Elena's arrival, nudged him forward. It was a voice that whispered of a kindness he hadn't shown in a long time, a connection he had deliberately avoided. He thought of Elena's innocent face, her bright eyes, her small, unburdened presence. He thought of her little drawings, her unintentional laughter echoing through the halls. He felt a desire, foreign and unsettling, to alleviate her simple wish, to bring a small comfort to the ailing child. He turned and walked away from the door, not back to his study but towards his car. The drive was a blur. He found himself at a toy store, a place he hadn't set foot in for decades. He felt awkward, out of place as he navigated the colorful aisles, searching for a white bunny just like the one Elena had described. He finally found one, soft and plush, with long, floppy ears and a tiny pink nose. It wasn't an elaborate gift, just a simple toy, but in his hands it felt heavy with an unspoken meaning. He bought it, along with the storybook itself, a copy of the one he'd seen. Back at the mansion, the late afternoon light was fading. Kenji held the small package, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and a nascent sense of purpose. He walked back to Elena's room. Maria was still inside, the lullaby now a soft hum. He didn't want to disturb them, didn't want to face Maria's surprised questions or Elena's potentially bewildered gaze. His intention was to remain anonymous, to simply leave the gift and retreat back into his solitary world. He carefully placed the wrapped bunny and the storybook just outside Elena's door, leaning them against the frame so they wouldn't be missed. He took a deep, quiet breath, a breath that felt different from any he had taken in a long time. Then he turned and walked away, the silence of the corridor closing in behind him, leaving the small package as a silent testament to a heart that was slowly, tentatively beginning to open. Elena's fever broke the next morning. Her breathing was easier, and the color slowly returned to her cheeks. Maria, exhausted but relieved, sat by her daughter's bedside, stroking her hair. She noticed the small package almost immediately, leaning against the doorframe. It hadn't been there the night before. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Who could have left it? The other staff members usually didn't come to this part of the house unless called. She picked up the neatly wrapped gift, her fingers tracing the smooth paper. It felt like a soft toy inside. Elena stirred, opening her eyes. "Mama?" Her voice was still a little raspy, but much stronger. "Yes, my love. How are you feeling?" Maria asked, setting the package gently on the bedside table. Elena coughed softly, then smiled. "Better." Her eyes landed on the package. "What's that?" Maria unwrapped it carefully, revealing the soft white bunny with floppy ears and the familiar storybook. Elena gasped, a small sound of pure delight. Her eyes widened, instantly recognizing the bunny she had wished for. Maria looked at the toy, then at the storybook. It was exactly what Elena had described. A wave of warmth, mixed with a little confusion, washed over her. Who knew about Elena's wish? Only she and Elena had been in the room. She looked around the quiet room, then out into the empty hallway. No one. She couldn't imagine Kenji Tanaka, the stoic billionaire, doing something like this. It seemed utterly out of character. Yet, who else could it be? The thought lingered, a small, hopeful spark in her mind. Elena, however, didn't seem to share her mother's uncertainty. She hugged the bunny tightly, burying her face in its soft fur. "He heard me," she whispered, her voice muffled by the toy. "Who heard you, mi hija?" Maria asked, her voice soft. Elena pulled back, her eyes bright and surprisingly knowing for a child her age. "Mr. Kenji, he heard me." Maria tried to argue, to suggest it might have been someone else, but Elena was firm. "It was him, Mama. He always knows." Maria didn't understand how Elena could be so sure, but she saw the pure joy on her daughter's face. She decided not to press the issue. Maybe, just maybe, Kenji Tanaka wasn't as unfeeling as he appeared. Later that day, Elena, feeling much better and clutching her new bunny, decided she needed to thank the person who had given her such a wonderful gift. Maria, still a little wary, tried to gently dissuade her. "Maybe you should rest a little longer, Elena," she suggested, thinking of Kenji's strict routine and his general dislike of disturbances. But Elena was determined. Her small, recovering body moved with a surprising resolve. She knew exactly where Kenji usually was at this time of day. In his study, a room Maria had always told her to avoid. Maria followed her daughter, apprehension growing with every step. What if Kenji was angry? What if he saw this as an intrusion? She imagined him, stern and unyielding, telling them to leave him alone. Her heart pounded in her chest. She reached the study door just as Elena, with her bunny tucked under her arm, pushed it open a crack. Kenji was indeed in his study, sitting at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by papers. He looked up, his expression unreadable, as the door slowly opened. His eyes, usually sharp and distant, seemed to soften just a fraction when they landed on Elena. Maria held her breath, ready to apologize, to pull Elena away, but Elena didn't hesitate. She walked slowly into the room, her small figure dwarfed by the grand space. Her eyes were fixed on Kenji. She stopped a few feet from his desk, her new bunny still clutched to her chest. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the soft rustle of papers as Kenji shifted slightly in his chair. He didn't speak, his gaze steady on the little girl. Elena looked up at him, her small face earnest and sincere. Her voice, still a little weak but clear, cut through the quiet. "Mr. Kenji?" she began, her voice a question. a gentle invitation. Maria braced herself, expecting a sharp dismissal. Kenji simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head. He waited. Elena took a breath, her chest still a little fragile from her illness. She looked directly into his eyes, those deep, dark eyes that usually held so much distance. She didn't offer a long speech, didn't try to explain her feelings. She just spoke from her heart, with the pure, unburdened honesty of a child. "Thank you," she said. Two simple words, two utterly commonplace words that, in that moment, held the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Maria watched, mesmerized, as something shifted in Kenji's face. His stern expression wavered. His eyes, which had been so guarded for so long, seemed to well up. A tremor ran through his body. He blinked, once, twice, and then a single tear, clear and unbidden, traced a path down his cheek. It was followed by another, and then another, until his face was wet with silent sobs. He made no sound, no dramatic gesture, just sat there, allowing the tears to fall, his shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. The dam had broken. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart, brick by painstaking brick, had crumbled under the innocent, sincere weight of Elena's two simple words. He covered his face with one hand, his body trembling, as years of suppressed emotion finally, powerfully, spilled out. Kenji's hand dropped from his face, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed, but now held a different kind of intensity. He looked at Elena, then at Maria, a raw vulnerability etched onto his features that neither of them had ever seen before. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, almost a whisper, as if unused to forming such fragile sounds. "My son," he choked out, the words catching in his throat. "He was just like you, Elena, always finding joy in the smallest things." Maria felt a cold wave wash over her. A son? Kenji had never spoken of a family, never mentioned a child. The staff knew nothing beyond his business dealings and his reclusive habits. This was a side of him that had been buried so deeply. It felt almost sacrilegious to witness its emergence. Kenji closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself. He took a shaky breath, the tears still flowing freely, but less violently now. He opened his eyes again, fixing his gaze on some distant point, as if reliving a memory. "His name was Hiroki," Kenji continued, his voice gaining a little strength, though still thick with emotion. "He was 5 years old, bright, curious, always asking questions. He loved to draw. Just like you, Elena, he saw the world with such wonder." He paused, a pained expression crossing his face. "One day, he found a small broken toy car in the garden. It was nothing, just a piece of plastic. But he picked it up, examined it, and then he looked at me, his eyes shining. He said, 'Papa, thank you for the car.' He fixed it himself with some glue and string. He was so proud." Kenji's voice cracked again. "I didn't understand then. I thought it was just a child's imagination, a broken toy. But he saw something more. He saw a gift, a treasure, in something I would have just thrown away." He shifted in his chair, turning slightly towards Elena, who was still standing quietly, her bunny clutched tight. "After he fixed it, he came to me again. He held up the toy car, all fixed and new in his eyes, and he said it again. 'Thank you, Papa. Thank you for making it better.'" The memory seemed to overwhelm him. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking once more. He died a week later. An accident, a sudden illness. They couldn't save him. Maria gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. The sheer, overwhelming grief in his voice was palpable. All this time, Kenji had carried this immense sorrow, this unbearable loss, hidden beneath layers of wealth and stoicism. I never thanked him back, Kenji whispered, his voice barely audible. I never told him how much his simple gratitude meant to me, how much he taught me about seeing beauty in small things. I was too busy, too focused on work. I thought there would be more time. He lifted his head, his gaze meeting Elena's. When you said, "Thank you, Elena," it was like hearing Hiroki again. The same innocence, the same pure heart. It brought it all back. The joy he gave me, and the guilt. The guilt of not appreciating it enough, of not cherishing every moment. Maria knelt beside Elena, wrapping an arm around her daughter. She looked at Kenji, her eyes filled with a profound understanding. The man who had seemed so cold and distant was, in fact, a father consumed by a grief so deep it had frozen his very being. His reclusive nature, his silence, his focus on work. It all made a terrible, heartbreaking sense now. He had built a fortress around himself to protect a wound that had never healed. Elena, sensing the depth of his sadness, gently took a step closer and extended her small hand, offering him her bunny. "He can be with your son, Mr. Kenji," she said softly, her voice full of a child's uncomplicated empathy. "He can keep him company." Kenji looked at the bunny, then at Elena's outstretched hand, then back at the small, earnest face. A fresh wave of tears welled in his eyes, but this time they seemed different. Less about the pain of loss and more about the unexpected comfort offered by this small, brave girl. He reached out, his large hand trembling slightly, as he gently took the bunny from her. He held it carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Maria watched, her heart aching for Kenji, yet also filled with a quiet awe for her daughter. Elena, in her simple purity, had seen past the billionaire and touched the broken man underneath. She had offered a lifeline, a bridge back to a humanity Kenji had long forgotten. News of the incident, though not the specific details of Kenji's confession, began to filter through the household staff. Whispers spread like wildfire. The usually unapproachable billionaire had cried in front of the maid's daughter. He had shown emotion. It was unprecedented. The household manager, a stern woman who had served Kenji for decades, found herself looking at her employer with a new, softened gaze. The gardeners, the cooks, the security staff, they all sensed a shift. The air in the mansion, once thick with an almost suffocating formality, seemed to lighten, to breathe. Kenji was no longer just the enigmatic, demanding employer. He was a man with a past, a man who had known profound sorrow, and a man who, perhaps, was finally ready to heal. His walls had cracked, and through that crack, a glimmer of light was beginning to shine. The shift in Kenji was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably profound. He no longer moved through the mansion like a ghost, his presence a silent weight. Instead, there was a subtle softening, a hint of warmth that had been absent for so long. He started greeting the staff, not just with a nod, but sometimes with a quiet, "Good morning," that surprised them all. His eyes, once shadowed and distant, now held a glimmer of something more, a readiness to truly see the people around him. The change was most evident in his interactions with Elena and Maria. He began to seek them out, not in a demanding way, but as if drawn by an invisible thread. He would often find Elena playing in the gardens, and instead of merely observing from a distance, he would approach. He'd sit on a nearby bench, sometimes without saying a word, just watching her, with a gentle smile. Other times, he would tell her stories, simple tales of his childhood in Japan, of mischievous foxes and wise old trees. Elena, with her bright eyes and boundless curiosity, listened intently, asking questions that often made Kenji chuckle. He even started teaching her simple Japanese words, and her innocent attempts at pronunciation brought a genuine joy to his face that Maria had never witnessed before. Their bond grew, a quiet, beautiful thing, built on shared moments and unspoken understanding. With Maria, his respect deepened into a quiet friendship. He recognized her strength, her quiet dignity, and her unwavering devotion to Elena. He would often ask for her opinion on household matters, valuing her practical insights. He even discussed his business, sometimes, not for advice, but as if needing to voice his thoughts to someone who listened without judgment. Maria, in turn, found herself opening up, sharing small stories about Elena's day or her own aspirations. She saw beyond the billionaire, beyond the grief, to the kind, intelligent man who was slowly reemerging. The initial apprehension she had felt around him had completely vanished, replaced by a genuine affection and concern. This transformation wasn't confined to his personal life. Kenji began to channel his renewed sense of purpose into his vast wealth. The first initiative he launched was a foundation dedicated to supporting single mothers, providing childcare, educational opportunities, and housing assistance. He named it the Hiroki Foundation, a tribute to his son, ensuring that his son's memory would be a source of life and hope for others. He personally oversaw the initial projects, pouring his meticulous attention to detail into creating programs that truly made a difference. He also funded a global initiative to build schools in underprivileged communities, particularly focusing on fostering creativity and empathy in children. Something he now understood was far more valuable than strict academic achievement. Kenji found a new sense of purpose beyond the relentless pursuit of profit. His business empire, while still thriving, became a means to an end, a tool to fuel his philanthropic endeavors. He delegated more, trusting his team, and spent more time engaging directly with the beneficiaries of his foundations. He spoke at conferences, not as a titan of industry, but as a man who had found his way back from despair, sharing his story with humility and a newfound passion for human connection. He often spoke of Elena, of the innocent wisdom of children, and how a simple act of gratitude had reshaped his entire world. The legacy of those two words, "thank you," became a central theme in his life. He often reflected on how such a small, commonplace phrase, uttered with genuine sincerity by an innocent child, had been the key to unlocking years of pent-up grief and regret. It wasn't just about gratitude. It was about acknowledging presence, valuing connection, and allowing oneself to be vulnerable. Elena's words had not just broken through his emotional barriers. They had shown him the profound, universal power of empathy. The final scene of Kenji's story was a stark contrast to his initial isolation. It was a sunny afternoon in the mansion's vast garden. Elena, now a few years older, was laughing as she chased a butterfly, her movements light and free. Maria sat on a bench nearby, a book in her hand, but her gaze often drifted to her daughter, a soft smile on her lips. Kenji was there too, not in a suit and tie, but in comfortable clothes, tending to a small rose garden he had started, carefully pruning a bush. He looked up, his eyes catching Elena's, and he offered her a warm, genuine smile. She waved back, then continued her joyful pursuit. The mansion, once a monument to loneliness, now echoed with life, laughter, and the quiet hum of genuine human connection. Kenji was no longer the enigmatic, unapproachable billionaire. He was a man who had been profoundly broken, and then profoundly healed, all because a small girl dared to say two simple words. He had found his way back to himself, not through wealth or power, but through the purest form of human kindness. His future, once bleak and solitary, was now bright, filled with purpose, connection, and the enduring warmth of a heart finally open to the world.